I'm grateful to President Garvey for his initiative in organizing this series of conferences, and to Professor Joe Capizzi and Steve Higgins and the staff of the Institute for Human Ecology in putting this all together. It takes a lot of work. Thank you. You'll also see that President Garvey has stolen my intro, which I'll have to take up with him. My parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary this past August. They are my heroes, not least for their selflessness and unfailing attentiveness to others. Early on in my marriage, I remember my mom, who's not a preachy person at all, saying, "The most important thing in marriage is trust." She didn't say romance or compatibility or even love. "Without trust," she continued, "you have nothing." In my 19 years of marriage, I've seen that borne out time and again. I know that my wife, Deborah, has my back, that she's always willing and acting for my good. I never have to worry that she's undermining me or even just pursuing some kind of personal agenda apart from me. That trust is the foundation on which our love has been built. If love is the greatest of gifts, as St. Paul reminded us this past Sunday, trust is the most necessary for any relationship. And trust, of course, is precisely what has been ruptured, violated so deeply by the sexual abuse crisis, which began or publicly reared its head in 1985 in the United States, emerged yet again in 1992 and 93, exploded radioactively in Boston in 2002, and almost unbelievably burst out again this past summer with the twin blows of the Pennsylvania grand jury report and the allegations that the now former Cardinal McCarrick had sexually abused both boys and seminarians. Today's conference is devoted, as we know, to the theme, Healing the Breach of Trust, Laity, Leadership, and the Crisis. My assigned topic is the engagement of the laity in Vatican II. My thesis is that the crisis of trust flows from the repeated failure on the part of numerous church leaders to be, among other things, honest, to be truthful. Lies, obfuscations, evasions, self-protective behavior, happy talk, and a lack of courage in truth-telling have undermined the trust that is essential for any effective exercise of authority. It is one thing to sin and to fail. It is another thing to cover up, hide, and avoid. Bishops, priests, deacons, and religious all have roles to play in healing that breach of trust. One of the things that has struck me most over the past few months, for instance, is the commitment of many priests, and especially newer bishops, to contribute to that reform. But today I'll focus on the contribution that the laity might make to healing that breach of trust in light of the teaching of Vatican II. I have no illusions that the laity are a silver bullet solution. Just like clergy and religious, the laity are sinners. We are prone to corruption, blindness, ambition, careerism, greed, lust, and the like. Conversely, and it's a sad fallout from this crisis that I even have to say this, neither are the clergy an evil, undifferentiated mass of evil. So many bishops, priests, and deacons are good, holy men. They're just as angry as the laity are at the sins and crimes of their brothers. But in a particular way, it is the laity's voice that needs to be heard anew today. I'll proceed in 3 steps. First, I'll speak briefly about the nature of this crisis. Second, I'll sketch the main themes of Vatican II's teaching on the laity and their mission in the Church. And third, in light of that vision, I'll indicate some ways forward for laity and clergy alike. The theme for this series of conference, Healing the Breach of Trust, Laity, Leadership, and the Crisis, raises the question, which crisis? If we don't answer that question correctly, our subsequent responses will fall short or be counterproductive and even harmful. So, which crisis? The crisis of the clerical sexual abuse of minors? The failure of bishops and other church leaders to respond rightly to that abuse? Is it a crisis caused by priestly celibacy, homosexuality, clericalism? Is it about sex abuse? Is it about power abuse? the abuse of prepubescent children, the abuse of postpubescent children, the abuse of vulnerable and subordinate adults. All of these aspects have their role to play. But in my judgment, what makes 2018 and 2019 different from even the events of 2002 has been the hornet's nest surrounding the former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, something that Cardinal DiNardo alluded to. As we all know, sadly enough, what he has done and what he has failed to do. All indications are that he will soon be dismissed from the clerical state. Furthermore, we now know that his former dioceses of Metuchen and Newark settled several cases alleging his sexual abuse and harassment of seminarians. Subsequent journalistic investigation by Catholic News Agency and some other outlets, and the explosive series of letters by Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano have raised grave, as yet unanswered questions concerning who knew about his sexual and likely financial corruption, who protected him and helped him rise in the Church's hierarchy, and the nature of the discipline that Pope Benedict imposed on him. McCarrick's case is a perfect storm in which virtually all dimensions of the crisis collide with each other. His case is thus a kind of apotheosis, a condensed symbol of the systemic rot involved in the sexual abuse crisis. The particulars of his case, though, reveal a much wider deformation in the Church as a whole. This is the crisis of trust. When truth is scarce or absent, some laity don't trust some clergy. Some clergy don't trust their bishops. Some bishops and the Pope don't seem to trust each other. How then can we move forward in such wrenching times? The late French Dominican and Cardinal Yves Congar shows one possible path. By any standard, Congar is the most significant ecclesiologist of the 20th century, and likely the greatest single theological influence on the documents of Vatican II. In 1950, he wrote what remains the definitive work on church reform, called True and False Reform in the Church. In that book, he speaks about three types of reform: two true and one false. The first type of reform is what he calls a reform of abuses. This type of true reform works in the realm of already given structures and practices. More pastoral than doctrinal, it seeks a more exacting observance of church discipline. Think of the Council of Trent mandating that bishops live in their dioceses and be present there during Holy Week. The second type of reform is what Congar calls doctrinal revolution. This false reform unacceptably calls into question some aspect of the Church's dogmatic, sacramental, and hierarchical nature. Congar sees Martin Luther as the classic example of such revolutionary reform, even if he's somewhat sympathetic to the concerns that motivated Luther's efforts. The third type of reform, I think, is the most important for our purposes here. It seeks what Congar calls a reform of a state of affairs. The French is état de choses, a mindset, a culture. This culture change, so to speak, is less specific than a reform of abuses. It instead seeks systemic reform and often calls for, in Congar's words, quote, new men and women who aren't prisoners of the system, end quote, who can question the system and find new ways forward. Most deeply, this reform involves a recentering on Christ and his paschal mystery. St. Francis of Assisi is Congar's exemplar of such reform. And I think it's no accident that St. Francis's efforts at reform began before the crucifix at San Damiano. Francis, rebuild my church, which, as you see, is falling into ruins. These are strong words from a strong-willed theologian and churchman in Congar. But I believe that this change of mindset is the most needed type of reform today when facing a crisis of trust. And I think that Vatican II offers a way forward for such ecclesial renewal. Vatican II did many things, of course, and at unprecedented length. But its teaching on the laity is marked both by its doctrinal content and its style. First, the council style. The Jesuit historian John O'Malley has noted that Vatican II adopted a largely epidictic style of rhetoric, which seeks not so much to be scholastic, to clarify concepts, as to heighten appreciation, to excite emulation of an ideal. It works by way of persuasion, not coercion. Vatican II, in O'Malley's view, is, quote, moved from the dialectic of winning an argument to the dialogue of finding common ground, end quote. This style or genre makes the conciliar documents inspiring in places, even poetic, but also sometimes ambiguous, sometimes deliberately so. There's something for just about everybody in those documents. O'Malley notes that this conciliar rhetoric of appreciation and ideals has a corresponding vocabulary. Absent, for better and worse, is the canonical and legislative language of preceding councils. What emerges instead are horizontal or equality words, brothers and sisters, collegiality, reciprocity words, partnership, collaboration, dialogue, humility words, pilgrim, servant, change or empowerment words, development, progress, participation, and interiority words, charism, conscience, holiness. This last word, holiness, leads to the heart of the matter. Although Vatican II is often known for its teaching on episcopal collegiality and papal primacy, on ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, on liturgy, to name only a few, O'Malley makes the striking observation that perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lumen Gentium is its 5th chapter on the universal call to holiness in the Church. That chapter of the Council's most important document on the Church said, quote, explicitly, forcefully, and for the first time ever in a council, that holiness is what the Church is all about, what human life is all about, end quote. Moreover, the Council makes clear that all believers are called to the same standard of holiness. Listen to this line from Lumen Gentium. Quote, it is evident to everyone that all the faithful of Christ, of whatever rank or status, are called to the fullness of the Christian life and to the perfection of charity, end quote. Vatican II's teaching on the laity unfolds from within that universal call to holiness and is one of the Council's signature achievements, in my view. Near the beginning of the 4th chapter, which is devoted to the laity, Lumen Gentium offers a definition of the laity. You'll see it on the back of the handout, the first quote on there, so I won't read it at length. But this definition or description of the laity highlights 4 dimensions. Baptism as the foundation of Christian life and equality, Christ's threefold office of priest, prophet, and king, the laity's participation in the mission of the church in the world, and 4th, secularity. Given that my colleague Mike Root will speak this afternoon about the laity's priestly and prophetic and kingly roles, I'll comment just briefly on the others. First, Lumen Gentium grounds lay identity in baptism. Baptism is what makes us Christi Fidelis, Christ's faithful ones. It makes us members of his body. Baptism is the foundational, most necessary sacrament of Christian life, and it creates an equal dignity among all the faithful, whatever their state in life. Second, the laity share in the mission of the whole Christian people in the Church and in the world. According to the Council, the laity are appointed to this mission, quote, by the Lord himself, end quote, through the sacraments of baptism and confirmation. Mission is rooted sacramentally and intrinsically, not juridically and extrinsically. Third, the laity are distinctively characterized by their secularity, their worldly character and mission. Such secularity differs from secularism, which would banish God from the worldly or temporal realm. This secularity is the special vocation and distinctive task of the laity, to order all worldly and temporal goods to the kingdom of God. This secular vocation, according to Vatican II, is not a runner-up prize for those not called to, quote, the sacred. The Council's emphasis on the laity's distinctive secular mission, though, should not be used to effectively say, the laity take care of the world and the clergy take care of the church. It's not a rigid division of labor. From one perspective, the entire church, clergy and religious included, has a secular character and mission. Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 40. From another perspective, the laity have a rightful, necessary role to play in the church. Some exercise that role through direct ecclesial employment. People who work for chanceries, people who work for the Bishops' Conference, lay ecclesial ministers. Others do so through involvements in various church organizations and associations. Perhaps most directly pertinent, though, for our discussion today is Lumen Gentium's often overlooked section 37 on laity-clergy relationships. That section, I think, tends to be somewhat idealistic, and it can seem like a soft, frictionless, and ultimately impotent or unrealistic section. This is a perennial danger of the Council's consensual, conciliatory rhetoric. But that section sets an essential, indispensable tone for laity-clergy relationships. It says that the laity are called to make their needs and desires known to clergy with freedom and with confidence. The laity likewise have the right and even the duty to express their opinion on matters pertaining to the good of the church to their pastors. They are also called to obey their pastors, following the example of Christ's own obedience. The clergy, for their part, must respect the dignity of the laity in the church, even, quote, willingly using their prudent advice and confidently assigning offices to them in the service of the church, end quote. The clergy are also called to foster lay initiative and to respect the legitimate freedom of the laity in temporal matters. This familiar or familial relationship between laity and clergy strengthens the church for, quote, its mission for the life of the world, end quote. We see in this section all of O'Malley's vocabulary: equality words, reciprocity words, humility words, empowerment words, interiority words. I think it's striking that so much of what the Council said here was taken up almost verbatim into some parts of the Code of Canon Law, Canon 212 in particular. Vatican II's style, or rhetoric, and its content thus offer what Congar meant by a reform of a state of affairs, a reform of mindset and culture. They deliberately and repeatedly speak of the laity-clergy relationship in terms of equality, opportunity, openness, confidence, trust, boldness. And I hope that these are the principles that guide the third concluding section of my paper. What are the steps forward? Equality, but not sameness, is the essential point of departure here. A sense of inequality, even a sometimes well-intentioned paternalist sense of trying to protect supposedly naive, innocent laity from scandal, fed the problem. It fostered a distance in which abusive clergy were more visible and real to church leaders than victims and survivors were. Writing in 2002, just a few months after the sex abuse crisis broke in Boston, the Notre Dame theologian John Cavallini noted the following. This is the second quote on the back of your handout. To this clerical culture, and especially its highest reaches, where the bishops and their closest priest associates reside, the laity and their concerns seem mostly invisible. How else can you explain the complaints of mothers and fathers that their serious worries about how their children were being treated were dismissed or evaded or given the runaround? There is no sense that these are our children, the church's children, but rather your children, those of the laity, whose duty is to listen and submit. In fact, the only way to explain this without invoking the deepest kind of active malice is by distance, end quote. That passage has stayed with me nearly 20 years. Some steps forward in this way are what Congar called reforms of abuses. My colleague, Sister Nancy Bauer, will delve more deeply this afternoon into the sort of canonical possibilities for lay engagement. So I'll offer only a few brief suggestions. greater lay participation in parochial, diocesan, national, and international organisms of communication, review boards. I think that lay involvement on priest personnel boards and episcopal nominations would be a good step towards accountability and transparency. And as it stands, there is little opportunity for laity to have structured input or feedback on the pastoral effectiveness of their priests. Likewise, advancement to the episcopate depends largely on the evaluation of priests by bishops. The evaluations of priests, deacons, and especially laity often count for little. Accountability tends to flow upwards only, not downwards. I'd add here the promise of what a number of American bishops, such as Edward Scharfenberger of Albany and Sean McKnight of Jefferson City, Missouri, have said about the prospect of lay involvement in boards reviewing allegations of abuse against bishops. I have on the flip side of the handout the entire text of a statement that Bishop Scharfenberger released, I think not accidentally, on the Feast of the Transfiguration, August 6, 2018. I'll read some parts from this. I think we have reached a point where bishops alone investigating bishops is not the answer. It is time for us, I believe, to call forth the talents and charisms of our lay faithful by virtue of their baptismal priesthood. What is needed now is an independent commission led by well-respected, faithful lay leaders who are beyond reproach. We bishops want to rise to this challenge, which may well be our last opportunity considering all that has happened. We must get this right. We need an investigation, and it must be timely, transparent, and credible. The more difficult and necessary steps, however, I think involve what Congar called a reform of a state of affairs or culture. This is where Cavadini's distance is most pernicious. First is what Yves Congar called the system, and what Ross Douthat of the New York Times just this past Sunday called, quote, the ransacked, decaying basilica that is American Catholicism, end quote. Strong words. What is this system? This is how we do things. That's just the way it is. What are you going to do? The shrugging of shoulders at careerism, corruption, duplicity, double lives. I've worked with the USCCB for 13 years on ecumenical matters. Not on staff, but as a participant in dialogues. And I've attended several meetings and conferences organized by the Committee on Doctrine. With very few exceptions, the bishops were respectful, good listeners. They were eager to be helpful. They wanted to hear. I had no sense whatsoever that they regarded me or other lay people in the room as inferior or second rate. There was no clericalism in that sense. Sometimes, though, I did detect a sense of, we know how things work around here. In this view, laity can be seen as good, well-intentioned, generous, but somewhat naive about how things really work. I think that bishops sometimes sell laity short. The American layman and journalist Russell Shaw, who spent nearly 20 years as the communications director for the American bishops, has written that church leaders, quote, might be surprised at what fast learners the laity can be if given the chance, end quote. There's also, with this greater involvement of the laity, the need not just for insiders, but outsiders who don't work for the church in one way or another. Outsiders who can say, why do you do things this way? Not out of a sense of criticism, but out of curiosity, who aren't habituated to familiar patterns. A second theme of culture reform, seminary formation. Although some might argue that clerical distance would be reduced or eliminated by the priestly ordination of married men, I think that the issue is much more complex. There are numerous closed and self-protective cultures populated overwhelmingly by non-celibates. Think of physicians and police, for instance. The greater challenge, I think, pertains to the formation of clergy, and it is here that the laity have an essential, irreplaceable role to play. Please allow me an anecdote here. College and graduate school can be self-absorbed times. I remember a doctoral classmate of mine, a religious sister who had spent years in primary and secondary education, saying that doctoral work felt so selfish. Like many college and graduate students, I spent my student years largely isolated from family life, especially from children. Some classmates were married and had children, but they seemed to live in a parallel universe to mine. As a husband and a father, I now cringe at my obliviousness then. I've taught at Catholic U for 10 years, and over that decade I've taught ecclesiology to hundreds of seminarians. Although I see seminarians primarily in the classroom and have no role in their spiritual pastoral formation, I've been pleased by the quality of the men. Less than a handful out of those hundreds have struck me as manifestly unfit for priestly ministry, not due to criminal activity, but just to personality or relational skills. By and large, they strike me as good, generous men who want to serve Christ and his church at a very difficult time in which the priesthood has little social prestige. I don't see much evidence of the, quote, little monsters that some fear them to be. Some of the seminarians who have most impressed me in this regard, who have been the least clericalist in the sense of having some kind of superiority complex to the laity, are some of the seminarians from Redemptoris Mater, the Archdiocesan Seminary conducted by the Neo-Catechumenal Way. I'm not a member of that community, but having seen these seminarians before and after their ordination, I'm always struck by the way they combine a clear sense of priestly identity with a remarkable closeness to the laity. From the outside, I think that their closeness comes from the fact that they spend their entire formation embedded in small communities of families. They receive constant support, feedback, and even criticism from these families. They are grounded. They are pastoral and responsive. They are unmistakably priests, and they are close to their people. Closeness and clerical identity aren't contradictory, but reinforce each other. Such accompaniment leading to friendship, I think, is the very best antidote to the clericalist distance that John Cavadini decries. Conversely, it is also the case that too many lay people perpetuate or at least acquiesce in clericalism themselves. Passivity can be quite comfortable and is certainly less demanding, but the universal call to holiness is demanding like nothing else. Third and finally, truth-telling as a part of this reform of culture, mindset, state of affairs. Believers have a right to know the truth on a natural level and the supernatural level. And the nature of the church as communion positively demands open, forthright, and truthful communication. Communion requires communication. I owe that insight to Russell Shaw. Secrecy is one obvious ongoing communications problem, but Russell Shaw has singled out what he calls spin and happy talk as especially pernicious. What is happy talk? Shaw calls it, quote, the dismissal of signs of crisis and decline in the church as matters of little importance, painful at the time perhaps, but somehow beneficial in the long run. Such distortions and denials of reality confer legitimacy upon abusive and destructive practices, end quote. Happy talk is not harmless. It's not simply blowing hot air. It is corrosive of truthfulness and of openness. It is wrong to speak to laity or any members of the church as if they are well-intentioned but ultimately dim children who need to be humored or managed or kept in the dark. The Pennsylvania grand jury report, deeply flawed though it may be, as Peter Steinfels has recently argued, turned my stomach with grief and disbelief at the depravity of sexual abuse. But it is Cardinal Wuerl's obfuscation that has made me angrier than anything over this past year, because it has shown how deeply ingrained such obfuscation is in the church's clerical and hierarchical culture, even after all of the events of the past 8 months. If the Cardinal did not lie about his knowledge of McCarrick's history of predation and corruption, and exposed his own seminarians to that predation, he at the very least has not told the whole truth. He did not intend to enlighten, but with lawyerly precision and impersonality, to obfuscate and possibly to mislead. His January 15th letter to his priests didn't really apologize to his priests for what he called his lapse of memory, and he has left his own priests hanging in public. Moreover, he has failed to address his people, the laity, directly at all for several months. This is a father who, despite his talents and long years of service, has too often given stones, not bread. The church needs an investigation into the whole McCarrick scandal of sex, money, and power that, in the words of Bishop Scharfenberger, is, quote, timely, transparent, and credible, end quote. The Pope alone can authorize such an investigation. Stonewalling, temporizing, demonizing, and dismissing are not acceptable responses. Catholics, especially in this instance, the most devoted laity, clergy, and religious alike, are hurting because of a lack of truth and transparency, even at the highest levels of the church. Such haughty evasiveness cripples the church's credibility and its mission. It makes trust difficult, even impossible for some. And in a particular way, it manifests distance, condescension, and even contempt for the laity, as well as the so-called lower clergy, priests and deacons. It is a scandal of its own. This is a far way away from Vatican II's vision of the universal call to holiness and the complementary equality of laity and clergy. As I said at the beginning of this talk, the Catholic laity are not silver bullets in this present crisis of trust. We have our own creaturely and sinful limits. But Vatican II offers a promising vision of equality, communion, openness, and collaboration that calls out for fulfillment, especially in the present crisis. And ultimately, the best remedy to the crisis of trust in the church is the one given in the letter of James. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no, that you may not fall under condemnation. Thank you.